Hey guys, it's Marinol from the Brown Gold Trekker blog and Peak Explorations. Welcome back to the second episode of the podcast series called On My Way from a Lawyer to a Mountain Nomad. Today I'm actually quite excited to tackle a topic that I would say is the least favorite of mine, but I'm still excited to talk about it because I think it's actually a necessary evil when you are thinking about a major shift in your life. I am talking about the idea of fear and the limiting beliefs that we have when we are facing a major decision in our lives. In my case, because I want to essentially travel the rest of my life after quitting my job of being a lawyer, this means there is a specific list of fears that goes with it, and it's rather unique on its own. And basically my plan is to live a life entailing a long-term travel type of lifestyle. So I want to just go over some of those things, and just to let you know, some of the fears I'm going to be referencing would actually require having a guest to discuss with me in my future podcast. So I'm really excited to host some people on my podcast to tackle some of the specific ones. So let me just talk about the obvious one, which is the number one thing that people will ask me or have asked me actually would be the finances and the money. That one, I'm going to save that for later because I really want to have someone in mind that I really think would be great in terms of this topic. So I'm really excited to tackle that later on. The other few things I want to go over include a few basically general basic concepts when it comes to this type of venturing out. The second one I want to start out with is the fear of being too old or the fear of being too late to do something different or going after your dreams. The third one I want to reference is the fear of change or adapting to a different lifestyle or instability. The fourth one is fear of failure. That would, in my world, that would mean something to do with my social enterprise and my blog. Then the fifth one I want to mention is fear of solitude and loneliness. And sixth would be the fear of the unknown and just the uncertainty, just the feeling of not knowing, because when you live a life where you've been so used to your career and you are so familiar, you know everything and you have a routine, and all of a sudden that's changing, it's the unknown and uncertainty part of it can be very, very intimidating. And it kind of goes hand in hand with fear of change, but I think the concepts are a little bit different from each other when you break it down. For today's episode, however, since I can go on and on with each and every one of this and I don't have all the time, I want to focus on the fear of solitude and loneliness, and the other ones I will tackle later on. So about fear of solitude and loneliness and just the idea of just being solo on a travel in general, there are a lot of different things and aspects about it. And I think that if I talk about the trekking, the backpacking wilderness part, I think also that one has a whole set of other things to worry about. So for the sake of the podcast, I'm just going to focus on long-term traveling in terms of the idea of solitude. So let's talk about fear of solitude. I think it's safe to say every one of us has this fear of being alone and feeling alone even in our daily lives, like being alone, being the solo person, for instance, to watch a movie alone or eat alone in a restaurant. Those things are intimidating. So how much more when you travel and be in a place where you're not familiar, and especially if you don't speak the language and it's a different culture. That's definitely scary. And I have to admit, I wasn't fearless from the beginning. I actually grew up getting used to being around people a lot, and to me being alone was such a major anxiety. And when I went to college and I went to law school, I was always surrounded by people. And even when I left law school, I ended up going to DC. And actually, that was my very first taste of being alone, in the sense that I actually ventured out. And I actually don't understand how that happened, to be honest, because all my life I was surrounded by people, and the idea of being in a new place was just something that I for some reason I just did. And I think one of the reasons why is because I was trying to get away from Seattle, where I was, because I felt a little bored with the environment. And a lot of my friends were getting married, and I was single, and I had this feeling of venturing out, but I wasn't sure exactly what venturing out meant in my life yet. So I ended up trying to practice law somewhere else instead of staying in Seattle. I took the bar in Washington, D.C. And I came to DC actually by myself with no job lined up. My plan was just to take whatever money I got and take my car with me. And actually, no, I take it back. I didn't take my car. I sold it at some point or got rid of it. Came to DC, and with just my money, my savings, I decided to take the bar exam and hope for the best that I pass so I can get a job. And all that, and that actually worked out for me. I didn't know anybody in DC, and so I had to rely on information from friends as to who I can live with. And there was one person that my cousin recommended, and I tracked her down, and we ended up being roommates. But I came with no job, no security. I had to find a job after I passed the bar, and so I actually even, decided to basically even go to New York, and applied for jobs there, but I decided to stay in Washington, D.C. and grab the job that was offered to me in the area that I want to practice in. But anyway, I say that to actually kind of note that was actually my first time experiencing real solitude in terms of travel. But I guess it wasn't as bad because I was still in the US. It was a normal transition from law school. It was a career move. So now I want to go over some of the things I learned over the years in terms of what it means to be fearful of solitude. One major shift in my life was when after I clerked for a judge for a year. That was my first job. When it ended, I didn't have a job lined up, so I decided to finally travel alone. And when I say that, I ended up actually packing my bags and going to Guatemala and indefinitely staying there to learn Spanish and also to travel. And that was really scary because I went to a country I didn't really speak the language. I knew a little bit of Spanish, but I've never been alone. And I was going to go to Guatemala, which somehow it was also known for being unsafe from a Western standpoint. So I was braving it. I went for it, and that was like one of the best decisions I ever made in my life. So in terms of just the things to think about when you are fearing being alone, one of the things that I was worried about is having to rely on myself 100%. There's no one there for me as a source of help. Now, that's an obvious thing. When you go someplace alone, there is not going to be someone specifically you can rely on. But I do want to note the reality of solo travel, and I think the secret behind this is the fact that you are never alone. It's actually a misconception. A lot of us think that when you go solo, you are going to be solo. In my experience, that's actually not true. When I went to Guatemala, I met so many people from my school, so I was able to find other people to meet. I actually lived with some of them because I was living with a homestay person, and the family hosted me. So I was able to meet my roommates and also students attending the school. I also took a year off from my office work, and when I traveled solo, even in China and places that I wouldn't imagine meeting anybody, I met people. So I'm actually a big believer of the idea that when you go solo traveling, I think the biggest problem you're going to run into is that you will never find the time to be alone, because more or less you will find them. you will find the people that you think you wouldn't. So it's actually a major misconception that I think that should be debunked. Now, the one thing I would recommend though, if you have anxiety over the idea of solo travel, is that you should research ahead of time what your place is about and where you're going to go and where you're going to stay and what your plans are. That would alleviate a lot of the anxiety and feel, so that you feel more comfortable going. If you want to do that, it's okay to actually rely on yourself and be alone and make sure that all the decisions you make are going to be based on your own decisions. That's actually a way to grow and improve yourself and be self-sufficient. It also makes you a stronger person. So I don't think you should actually fear the process. I think you should embrace this as a good learning experience for you as a person. It's really important to embrace the idea of solo travel and accept the fact that it is a good learning experience. The other one that comes up a lot is that it's dangerous to go alone. This actually is not true in many circumstances. I've been traveling for over 15 years and even took 1 year off and went to 21 countries, and most places are safe, even places that are remote and places that people think are unsafe. It's very rare to actually find yourself in a dangerous situation. And I do have to admit, there were times when I had a little bit of a iffy situation when I was on an island by myself, and this was in the Philippines. I even spoke the language. I didn't really expect that it would happen in a place where I am fluent in the language, but because I was alone on a small island with a couple of guys, 2-3 men who were running the island, it was not the best scenario for a girl to be in. So in the end, it worked out. It was nothing. There were like just a few guys who were getting drunk and nothing really came out of it. But I was obviously guarded at that point, and I really didn't sleep that night because I was tenting in the island and also surrounded by these men. So I realized, well, maybe it's not really best to go on an island by yourself. And so something I learned, in terms of camping and being in the wilderness, that you really should know what you're doing. But in the end, it worked out. There were also moments when I was in China when I have to make decisions quickly whether what I'm doing is a safe thing. There was a time when I went on a van full of Tibetan men in the middle of nowhere to get to another town. And I think the key thing really is with danger is you have to follow your intuition. You really have to have good instinct, and that's something you can work on before you travel. The third one I want to point out is, the feeling of loneliness. Again, I want to emphasize the fact that you are never alone when you travel solo. So it's very unlikely you will feel lonely. You will meet a lot of friends, especially if you go to hostels, if you hike on the trails. It's easy to find friends, and that happened to me many, many times. And also, it's easy to reconnect with your friends back home. The online social media is such a big thing now that it's not hard at all to make contact with them if you really feel lonely and you want to just talk to someone. And I have to confess something. In terms of just the dating life, on the road, it's actually, for me, I've been very lucky because I met more men or people or potential partners for me that actually fit my goals and my personality and my outlook in life. The people that I met along the way are actually the kind of people that I would want to date. So if I want to be honest with you, I'd tell you to, if you're single, honestly, you may find your partner along the road. It's a very, very, very likely thing to happen, because I've actually dated some of the people or men that I've met along the road. Some of them met in the trails in Patagonia. We became friends and later dated. So it's actually an interesting world, and you shouldn't limit yourself to dating locally. To be honest, it's doable to meet, to actually have a relationship long distance. Eventually it may work out. You just never know. I would just say, just keep an open mind. The other thing is communicating in different languages, and if there's a language barrier, there's something to be concerned about alone. obviously, because you want to get to from point A to point B. You want to be able to survive the experience. But I have to say, this isn't really much of an issue these days. There's Google Translate that you can rely on. You can learn the language. You can bring a book. You can research again your itinerary. You can have Google Map as a source. There are a lot of ways to get around that. So for my long-term travel plans, even if I end up going to Tajikistan or some other country that I have no idea how to speak the language, I feel no threat about that, because I think there's always a way. And to be honest with you, there are ways to communicate without speaking, actually. And I've actually experienced that in China, where I was still able to communicate with people. And it's hard to explain, but I think there is power in just being able to gesture and smile and look at people in the eye and just express yourself in whatever language, and people will still get it. It's hard to explain, but you have to try it yourself. That's not to say you shouldn't learn the language. I think it's very helpful to do so, and it's kind of nice for locals to know that you know their language too. The next point I want to say is missing your friends and family. Again, I already noted that you can keep in touch with them through social media, so it's not much of an issue really. If I go away now for a long term and away from the US, I'm not even concerned about that. When I was away for a year, I actually didn't miss my friends that much because they were always online. And also I realized when I am in US, I actually spend the same amount of time in the US versus when I was away with them. I didn't see them all the time. Everyone's busy in DC, and everyone seems to be active and doing things, and it's hard to find time for friends. And so that's the reality of it. So sometimes actually it makes it better when you're away, because people miss you and they actually reach out to you, and you have a better conversation about what's going on with your life. It's actually more intimate. So in a way, it improves your relationships with people back home a lot. And along the way, you're meeting new people. So you shouldn't feel worried about losing out on friendships and relationships, because there's always a way to connect. And finally, I want to just note that one thing that came to mind in my head was, what if I get sick or injured? And that is probably one of the worst scenarios. And I have been sick alone in Malaysia, and it wasn't easy. It was pretty bad. And I had to take care of myself and be make sure that I had to get the care that I needed. But luckily I was able to just survive it. It was a major bad case of flu and some stomach problem. But in reality though, back home in the US, I'm gonna experience the same problems anyway, and I am alone in US. So there's not much difference if you really think about it. So this fear that I have about being sick or injured, that can happen anywhere. It doesn't have to be overseas. But I also want to note that I have been injured when I was hiking in Montenegro on a mountain, and I fell because of slipping on an ice. And luckily I was with people, and people are very, like I said, are very happy to help. By nature, humans are very helpful. And so I don't think you should worry much about not getting any help or being injured and not being able to get out of the situation. I've been lucky because I was able to get transported to back to the hostel, and my hostel host was actually very nice because he took me to the hospital for treatment. Now, if you're alone though in a city or by yourself, I think the best advice I'd have is to actually make sure you take preventive measures to take care of yourself and to avoid the scenario overall, because that's really the key to it. You don't want to get yourself in a situation to begin with, because it is tough when you're sick or injured, because you just never know what ability you have when a crisis happens. So the best advice really, even for myself and for everyone, is you have to just take care of yourself. Make sure when you're traveling you eat well, you exercise, you're active, you have your medication if you need it. And I do have to confess, when I did my 1 year away, I brought a lot of drugs with me, and the people that I were traveling with were laughing at me because they think I was just paranoid and that it was so unnecessary to bring all the drugs that I brought. And they were right, because when I brought all the drugs, all these antibiotics, and even some of them were even prescription, and all these like, painkillers, I realized also you don't have to worry too much about bringing drugs with you all the time. You can actually access them in other countries. And you'd be surprised, because treatment in other countries and medication and going to the hospital even is not that expensive. When I got hurt in Montenegro, I got free medication and free treatment from the hospital. They didn't even charge me. I was ready to give them money, but they said no, it's free. When I was in Thailand, when I was with my ex-boyfriend, he fell off a mountain, racing up a mountain, and got injured and had cuts and wounds on his leg. And we had to go to an emergency room, and I think it only cost him $50 for the entire time, the entire treatment. So it's very affordable. I don't even think you need insurance, really. I mean, you can also get travel insurance, and luckily I've never really had to use them, but that can also be expensive. In my case, that's something I'm going to have to research more, because it may not even be worth it. Because when I was doing research, let's say in Tanzania, or even in, my experience with Montenegro and Thailand, the medical expenses are not that expensive. And I think when we're in America and living here, we're so used to the idea that medication and medical treatment are expensive as heck. Well, luckily in other countries, medication and treatment are not that expensive, and they can be very affordable without insurance. And that's actually a fact. I've had that happen in Thailand, Malaysia, in Montenegro, in Philippines. So it's something to just keep in mind, that for peace of mind, that it's really not that bad of a thing. If you get sick and get treatment, you shouldn't feel scared to get treatment because you're worried it's too expensive. Most of the time it's not. So to actually wrap up this episode, I did write an article on Huffington Post called 8 Ways to Mentally Prepare for a Solo Adventure. It does give you some ideas on how to mentally prepare, because I think one of the biggest things about solo adventure is that we have anxiety about it, and that's just a natural thing. And I think to be successful in a solo adventure type situation, mentally you should be prepared, as well as physically, and just being physically, logistically prepared. Everything has to be prepared. Not just, it's not just all about planning, it's also about how we approach things. And so I think the article that I wrote would be something that I think you guys should check, because it's pretty useful outline of some of the things that in general would apply to solo traveling and even solo trekking. And one last thing I want to say is, I think the best thing really is to research what you're doing ahead of time, because the more information you have, the better you feel about it, and the more you're prepared mentally, the less anxiety, and the more you're going to enjoy the experience. So that to me is how I would envision what it means to be fearful of solitude and what it means in terms of traveling. And I hope this gives you a little bit of an insight, because I think what I went over actually applies to any kind of traveling. It doesn't have to be like a long-term travel like I'm doing. So the next episode, I'm going to tackle more of the other fears, and so tune into that, because I think it's also beneficial to go over the other things that I want to address, especially the money, and also the idea of the changes and instability, and just the age factor. That's something I really have to tackle, because I'm doing this mid-career. The change from a lawyer to a nomad is happening at an age when I think by society standard I should be having a family and having kids. So I'm not a millennial, obviously. I guess that's what I'm saying. So, but anyways, guys, thanks for tuning in. I hope you found this to be helpful. And if you do have questions about the episode, I would love to hear from you. Go write them down on YouTube or the comment section on Facebook, and even email me if you have questions specifically about this or anything about the podcast of, moving from a 9 to 5 to a different kind of world, which would be becoming a nomad or becoming an entrepreneur. So anyways, thanks for tuning in, guys, and have a good rest of the next couple of weeks. And until 2 weeks from now, take care. Bye bye.